Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better.
Desire motivates most of the world. The economy of the world, for example, runs on desire or demand. With no demand, products and services aren't purchased. If products and services aren't purchased, the economy grinds to a stop. If you have any doubt about that, read Brodel's excellent Civilization and Capitalism, 15th to 18th Century, 3 volumes. The nature of human life is the automatic consequence of the overall level of human consciousness itself, end quote. From Discovery of the Presence of God by David R. Hawkins, M.D., Ph.D. Again, on the log energy scale of human consciousness from 1 to 1,000, where 200 indicates empowerment and 600 indicates sagehood, about 80% of the world's human population calibrates at 199 or lower. That's below the level of truth or love. Most animal species calibrate at that level. Therefore, about 4 out of 5 human beings live as if gaining, acquiring, getting, accumulating were the purpose of human life. Since it's not, and there's no good reason for that, it's sad. They may not think that incessant gaining is their way of life, but a lifestyle of endless pursuit is what they condemn themselves to. Even if it's just a constant craving for new experiences, it's impossible for that to result in abiding happiness. The reason why is due to the presence of an underlying feeling of lack or incompletion that results in chronic dissatisfaction and then the endless seeking behaviors. Wantingness is an egoic structure based on the egoic positionality or assumption that happiness comes from without. Since that's false, quote, wantingness leads to insatiability, frustration, and anxiety, as well as greed, avarice, and chronic acquisitiveness, end quote, from Dr. Hawkins' Transcending the Levels of Consciousness. Sages have been saying this for literally thousands of years. In the Dhammapada, for example, the Buddha teaches that ignorance is, quote, the greatest toxin, end quote, that poisons our lives, and that, quote, you must dig out the root of craving. You must cut its root with insight, end quote. Wallace translation. In the previous video, there was a claim that, along with pride, ignorance, and fear of death, desire is one of the 3 prime supports of the ego. Desire calibrates at 125. By way of comparison, grief, which as you likely have experienced can be extremely powerful, calibrates at only about 75. Because this scale is logarithmic rather than arithmetic, about a 50-point difference is a huge difference. The power of desire calibrates at 10 to the 125th power, whereas grief's power is only about 10 to the 75th power. In other words, desire is a hell of a lot more powerful than grief. A little desire, of course, enhances the prospects for survival, which is the ego's task. For example, it's good to be thirsty when we need water, or hungry when we need food. There'd be no survival of our species without sexual desire. Without air to breathe and protection, we'd quickly die. It's the pathological forms of chronic desire that are the problem. For example, there's the endless drive for more sex, or possessions, or experiences, or praise, or power, or whatever, that creates endless feelings of incompleteness, as well as sensory slavery or bondage. The more we focus on what we want and don't have, the more dissatisfied we become. Compulsions and addictions, which trigger our brains to release neurotransmitters associated with pleasure, are not only not eliminated by negative consequences, but also they block living freely. What's the payoff for the ego? Why is incessant wantingness good for it? It's because our focusing on what we lack strengthens separation. The more separation there is, the stronger the ego is. A complete lack of separation would mean ego death, which is why the ego wants more separation as insurance against non-existence. Of course, no separation would also mean peacefulness, but peacefulness is a non-egoic value. So, the ego strengthens itself by collecting injustice, hatred, possessions, pomposity, and pride. Ultimately, it's collecting energy to keep going, which the ego requires since it lacks spiritual energy, in other words, its own source of energy. If the ego doesn't win at the game of collecting external energy, it dies. This is why the more we develop spiritually, the more ego delusion diminishes. The ego dramatically weakens at level 500 and dissolves at levels 600 and higher. Like all ignorance, ignorance about desire is cured by understanding. Distinguish a desire from its object. For example, distinguish hunger, which is the desire for food, from its object, namely food. What's the good with respect to hunger? There's only one answer. It's annihilation. We eat food to make hunger disappear. It's painful to experience hunger. Notice that question is not the question, what's the good with respect to food? Let's here focus on the desire rather than on its object. The good with respect to food is presumably that, for example, it nourishes our bodies and may be delicious. So, even for natural desires like hunger, their good is their non-existence. So much the worse for unnatural desires, such as those created by modern advertising. The old animal desire reward system works to continue animal or bodily survival. At consciousness levels of 200 and above, however, desires are created by deciding what to pursue rather than by the evolutionary prompt of wantingness. At higher levels of consciousness, the ideal is to want nothing. In other words, to be free from all desires or cravings. There's no abiding serenity, joy, or bliss without that. What about natural bodily desires like hunger? At the highest levels of consciousness, and so freedom, even the desire to have a body evaporates. Remember that no more than your thoughts, beliefs, or emotions, your body is not you. It, too, is only an it. In the next video, let's consider anger, which is an extremely powerful emotion. Let's end emotional distress.